thank you all for coming for today's presentation. My name is Vijay Mohan. I'm an economist and an independent researcher in the space. I think following Dr. Hansen is a pretty hard act, but anyway, I'd like to share some thoughts on voting with time commitment. That is how you use time commitment for blockchain governance. So just to give you some background, we're all familiar with token-based voting, which is that you have a certain number of governance tokens, and based on the number of governance tokens you have, you get voting power in proportion to that. So this is something we're all quite familiar with. But when you go through the literature, both the academic literature and, in fact, blog posts by practitioners, there are three problems that keep cropping up. So the first one is a plutocracy. So by plutocracy, I mean that there are certain token holders who are whales. They have a disproportionate amount of those governance tokens, and they're able to influence the decisions from the voting process. The second one is a Sybil attack, and this comes because a blockchain is pseudonymous, so it's sort of the blockchain equivalent of voter fraud. You basically create multiple accounts with fake identities, and you do that because the voting mechanism you have gives you some advantage of doing so. So that's the second problem. And the third one is vote buying, where you buy tokens just before a vote. The idea being that you buy those tokens to control the vote, and you sell them immediately after. Right, so you're sort of buying that proposal, and it's all happens very quickly. You buy it, you vote, you hijack the proposal, and then you sell. And what we are finding is that a lot of DAOs are adopting some voting scheme that's out there. Could be one token, one vote, could be quadratic voting. They've heard about it. None of these were necessarily blockchain-based things. They adopt it, and then what they find is later on, 6 months, 1 year, 2 years down the road, you're left with one of these problems, right? Either you find that, so for example, if it's one token, one vote, you would expect that you may end up with a plutocracy. And that's the problems that you end up finding. And then there's a lot of talk about, oops, we've got a plutocracy here, or our voting mechanism has been Sybil attacked. So, I mean, the question we need to ask is, what if we took one step back, looked at the big picture, and said, if I wanted to develop a voting mechanism from scratch, well, how do I think about it so that I minimize the chance of these problems coming up at the end? And that's what I tried to do with two co-authors, Payman Kaiser and Chris Berg. We wrote a paper which was published this year where we essentially asked that question. If we start thinking about these problems right at the get-go and build things from scratch, and we think about all the ways in which these things can be linked. For example, how is a plutocracy linked to a Sybil attack? How can we reduce vote buying? Because we know we're going to end up with these problems at the end. How would that look? So that's sort of the problem we attacked. And what we ended up doing was, well, we proposed a new voting scheme, which said that, well, this might have a lot of potential in circumventing those problems and have even additional beneficial features. So it's sort of a new voting mechanism we proposed. I would love to hear your feedback at the end of it, of course, but that was one of the main things about this paper. And overall, we really wanted to emphasize this idea of time-based suffrage. So there's this paper by, I think it was KS and Leos, if I remember correctly, where they identified a lot of different voting schemes, suffrages. They said, well, there's token-based suffrage, there's meritocracy, and there's identity-based. Conspicuously absent was time-based suffrage. And we really wanted to emphasize that, look, time has value for a voting mechanism on the blockchain. So I'm going to get a little bit technical but it's just basic technicalities that I need to get across. In any token-based voting system, you're going to have to find a way to connect the number of tokens you have to the number of votes you get. And that's all this function is saying. It's just saying that you've got to take the number of tokens and come up with some scheme to convert it to votes. So the simplest one is one token, one vote, where that function is just V of Q is equal to Q. Every token you have, you get one vote for it. But you could go to town with this problem, right? You could say that I'm going to square it, I'm going to cube it, I'm going to take the logarithm of the number of tokens I have, I'm going to take an exponent. You can do whatever you like with it. So depending on what you do, you are going to affect these problems, the Sybil attack problem and the plutocracy problem. And our goal here is to put some structure into this problem. That if you go to town with this and you say, I want to make a log of Q as my voting mechanism, sure, go ahead and do it, but what problem are you going to end up with? How do we think about it right from the beginning? So what we show in that paper is that under very reasonable conditions, by which I mean when you rule out crazy stuff like collusion and things like that, all you can do to prevent a Sybil attack with that basic transformation from tokens to votes that you've created is to make sure that that function is linear in tokens. If you curve it the wrong way, you're going to end up with a Sybil attack. So it's got to be linear in tokens. We also show, and it sort of makes sense, right? If you think about it intuitively, let's suppose you have 10 tokens and everything is linear. If you take the 10 tokens and split it into 2 accounts of 5 each, well, 5 plus 5 is still equal to 10. So as long as you maintain that linearity, there's going to be no incentive for you to open multiple accounts. So that's the simplest way to tackle that Sybil resistance problem. However, with plutocracy resistance, you need to put some curvature on that function. You need to sort of make it strictly concave, by which I mean that every token that you vote with, additional token that you vote with, you get more votes, but each additional token gets you less votes than the previous one did. So it sort of tapers off, and that also makes perfect sense. If you want to control a plutocracy and make sure people don't, maximize the power of their tokens too much, every additional token that they put in, the influence of that should taper off. And that's what this says. But if you think about it, you cannot have both simultaneously. You cannot have a straight line function, which is linear, the first one for Sybil attack, and a curvy function to get rid of plutocracy, which is the second one. And that's what we call the Sybil resistance, or the plutocracy Sybil dilemma, which is that you got to pick one. Right? If you're going to make it straight, if you're going to make that function a straight line, you'll get rid of a Sybil attack, most likely, but you are going to end up with a plutocracy. If you put a curve on it, you'll control a plutocracy, but be prepared for a Sybil attack. And that's the dilemma that you're faced with a pure token-based voting system. So all blockchains that are based on that have token-based voting have only two options. They either have to, the way they structure that conversion from tokens to votes, they can either do it in a manner which gets them plutocracy resistance, but they've got to find some other way to control the Sybil problem. Because that plutocracy resistance only comes when you curve that vote function a particular way. Or you can make that vote function linear, in which case, yes, you've made your vote function as Sybil resistant as possible, but then you've got to find some other way to tackle the plutocracy. So it's not enough to have V as a function of Q alone. You actually need two resources or two instruments. And this is very well known in economic policy, right? So when you're looking at an economy and you've got two national policy targets, say you want to control inflation and you want to control unemployment, you cannot achieve it with one instrument like interest rates because they're moving in opposite directions. You need two instruments. And that's exactly the first insight we want to give, is that you can't make just V as a function of Q alone and tackle both these problems. You need a second instrument. You tackled one problem, you need a second instrument to tackle the other one. So the second instrument that we are proposing, apart from Q, is time commitment, where when you vote, you lock up your tokens for a certain amount of time as well, right? So basically, you've got two resources now. You've got two voting instruments. You've got Q and you've got T. And one attacks one problem, the other attacks the other problem. And we're actually quite familiar with this because Curve does use that sort of logic in its voting function. So for those of you who are familiar with Curve, it's just Q times T is what they're really doing, where T I'm measuring is a quarter of the number of years that you lock. And of course, you could go crazy with this, right? You could say that I'm going to lock one token for 1 million, billion, gazillion years, and I'm the king of Curve. Well, to prevent that, they've capped it off. They've said that 4 years is the maximum, and that would make sense, right? So every time you want to have a time commitment here, we want to cap off the time commitment so that one person doesn't put 1/10 of a token for 1 trillion years and somehow gets a lot of votes. So the time commitment there is capped off at 4 years. But Curve also introduces a lot more strictness. The vote escrow Curve token that it introduces is non-transferable. You cannot get out of that time commitment. It's absolutely locked. So they've got these other details that are happening behind that vote function. But if you just look at it, it's pretty nice, right? It's linear in queue, so my guess is that this is going to be pretty Sybil resistant, and it's got time. So if you don't have tokens, you can use time to sort of fight with someone who does have tokens. So it's sort of ticking the box there, and I like this when I first see it. And any type of time dimension that you add to the voting process, you are going to provide a disincentive for vote buying. Because the idea of vote buying is that you buy tokens, you vote, and then you immediately sell them. And your whole purpose is to control the voting. If you put any type of time delay, even if it's a 2-day time delay or 4 years like Curve does, it is a disincentive for vote buying because you've locked your tokens and they can't get rid of it immediately. So there's an opportunity cost for them to keep those tokens locked. So time commitment has 2 immediate benefits. The first is that you've got this other instrument with which you can express the intensity of your preferences. And second, you've got protection against vote buying. So out of those 3 problems, time commitment almost immediately solves one, which is vote buying. And the other nice thing about time commitment is that you cannot launch a Sybil attack with time. If you're going to create multiple accounts, you cannot populate those accounts with time. You've got to populate them with tokens. So time cannot be exploited for a Sybil attack the way tokens can be. So we don't have to worry. Once we've introduced time into that vote function, we don't have to really worry about time being used for a Sybil attack. Your focus is always on tokens being used for a Sybil attack. So the overall picture that comes now is let's structure our voting function in such a way that it's linear and we minimize the chance of a Sybil attack. And then you use time to counter the plutocracy. 2 different instruments acting in 2 different ways, right? So you structure it so that the one which can be used for a Sybil attack, you eliminate that possibility. The other one, time, which cannot be used for a Sybil attack, you let that do the plutocracy. So if I go back to that vote escrow that Curve has, like I said, it's pretty nice at the face of it, but the devil's always in the detail. Even though Curve has got a lot of strict rules behind it, that you cannot transfer it, you cannot get rid of that time commitment, actually you can. Even if you don't sell the vote escrow tokens, you can actually sell your claims over the locked tokens to someone. It's over the counter, and it's quite complicated, right? But it can be done. There are some articles, I think by Open Zeppelin, which describe exactly how you can sell your claims over those locked tokens, even if you can't sell the locked tokens themselves. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it, to get out of what, that time commitment which is completely inflexible, is to add another layer. And I think that's where Convex came in. They said, look, it's completely inflexible, let's add another layer which adds flexibility, right? And then after Convex came Votium, after Votium came someone else, and pretty soon no one knew what was going on, who owned what, who was voting for what, and we all gave up trying to figure that particular problem out. So yeah, you can circumvent that extreme time commitment in certain ways, but wouldn't it be just nice to be able to get rid of your time commitment? For whatever reason, you need to appease your spouse, you need funds for school, you don't like that platform anymore. Get rid of the time commitment and move on. So we think that flexibility is a good thing, that the strict thing that Curve has introduced is too strict, and that's why you've seen all these layers being added to that. And also, if you think about the fact how the way vote escrow is structured, once you've committed for, say, 4 years, you can vote again and again on proposals with those locked tokens. There's a decay rate and all that, but basically, you don't have to think about what are important proposals anymore. You just keep voting, time after time with that power of wealth that you have, without actually having to think about the proposals. So wouldn't it be nice if all the voting took place on a proposal-by-proposal basis, so that people actually have to think, especially whales and other people who have, if you're going to put all your monetary backing behind one proposal, what's it going to mean for the next one? Right? So, and of course, given the first point, if you can get out of it, well, maybe you will incur some loss, but if the next proposal is valuable enough, you have to think about it. At this point, with Curve, you don't. And of course, this is linear in both ways. It's linear with respect to Q, which is a good thing, which gives you Sybil resistance, but it's also linear with respect to T, which means that if you really want people to encourage them to commit for the long term, this doesn't scale well. It's like additional unit of time, it linearly increases. Why not give that more power? If your DAO is interested in long-term commitment, why not give as much power as possible to long-term commitment? So we started off with these three problems: plutocracy, Sybil resistance, and vote buying. But once we went into the curve mechanism, there seemed to be a lot more, desirable features that we could add. We could give that T function part of it more power to justify long-term commitment. We could make it proposal by proposal so that everyone has to think about where are you going to put your money. If you don't like it at the end after 6 months and you think that, oh my God, this platform is going the wrong way, you can get out of that time commitment, right? You don't have to rely on convex and this and that and complete chaos to be able to have flexibility. It's built into the problem. And there is some mechanism for information to be generated from the voting process, which I haven't talked about before, and I'll talk about that briefly in a minute. So the idea we came up with at the end is something called bond voting. And I won't go too much into detail into this. The paper is published, and anyone who's interested can take a look or just come and see me, and I'm happy to chat about it. But what we did was we started off with a zero coupon bond, like a treasury bill, and said that, well, you get a coupon payment at the end, you buy it at a discount. What if we did that with voting? You get one vote, and how much you commit determines how much of a discount you get in terms of how much you have to stake in order to vote. So we played around with that idea for a while, and this is the formula that we ended up with, where it's linear in Q, but it's exponential in T, right? So it should be fairly Sybil resistant because of the linearity in Q, but that exponent in T gives you a lot of incentive for long-term commitment because you get a lot of benefit from it. And R is an interest rate parameter that's fixed by the bond governance, the blockchain governance. And intuitively, the way we like to think about it is that suppose you commit a certain number of tokens Q for a certain amount of period T. Think of it as the platform issuing a voting bond for you. And you can just think of that as an NFT. So you get an NFT which says, this is the amount of tokens you've committed, this is the time for which you've committed it for. And the reason I want to think of it as an instrument is because once I've got that NFT, if I don't want to commit anymore, I can sell that NFT. I can trade that instrument in a secondary market. The market will decide how much to pay for it, but it will let you get out of that commitment with maybe a small market-based penalty. It's not the platform introducing any penalty on you. It's what the market thinks those tokens are valued, that you've locked up before, what they think they're valued now, right? So that gives you a sort of a way to get out of the commitment. It's tradable in a secondary market. And an important thing about a secondary market is that it carries information. So when you look at treasury bills or bonds, you look at the slope of the yield curve to think about what is the economy, how is the economy performing. So when the yield curve turns negative, you think that, well, maybe a recession is oncoming. You can have that same sort of logic here. Once there are enough maturities of these voting bonds, you see the sort of implicit return that you're getting on them, the interest you're getting on them, and if that is sort of downward sloping yield curve that you get, it tells you that the market view is that the blockchain is not in good shape. So there are informational properties. The same way we get information from bond trades, you can get information from voting bond trades as well. So it ticks a lot of these boxes. And here I just had a quick diagram, not particularly useful, I guess, at this point. But the green one is your vote escrows. It's a straight line with respect to T. I've got time commitment on my horizontal axis. And here I only had 18 periods. But the red one is bond voting. And if you keep extending that, it'll just escalate and exponentially go up. So it starts slow, but it really rewards long-term commitment, right? So just to summarize the benefits of bond voting, it's linear in tokens, so it should be Sybil resistant. You've got time to fight the plutocracy problem. Time commitment solves the vote buying problem. You've got T as an exponential function, so the power of time commitment increases very rapidly. You really reward long-term commitment to that platform. We actually solve for the dynamics of this as well and say that even after you lock up, if a new proposal comes in and you really want to vote for that one, what would your reaction be? So we sort of think about the dynamics and justify why proposal by proposal voting should work in this scheme. Staking with flexibility, you've got sort of this NFT that you can get rid of whenever you think that commitment is no longer valuable. You don't need Convex and Votium and all these things to come up on top of that. And when you've got this happening for a large amount of time, you will see that there are informational properties that you can get out of it, just like we get information from bonds. So that sort of summarizes what I would like to say. And thank you again for coming today. And if you have any questions, please reach out, or just want to chat, please reach out to me. Thank you.
Epic stuff, Vijay. Thanks very much. So, audience, don't forget to scan the QR code and submit any questions that you might have, or upvote the ones that exist. So, first question there, are there any examples of voting mechanisms which could involve ETH?
I mean, it's a DAO by DAO. I'm not sure I understand the question exactly, but yeah, I mean, if your token, governance token is ETH in any way, or your platform, whatever your DAO has as the governance token, your voting mechanism is based on that. So yeah, it could involve ETH. In fact, there are actually very clever ways of doing it. I don't want to get into too much detail now, but you could sort of make ETH a numeraire for your DAO, and then instead of using your token, use the ETH token with the numeraire, but then you've got to worry about your token versus the ETH token exchange rates and stuff like that. So actually, that's a very good question. There are answers to it, but it's a bit involved. Yeah.
Good. Well, I'm glad the question hit at the end there. Okay, so maybe just maybe a clarification. At one point, one of the audience members thinks you described collusion as crazy, crazy unlikely.
No, it's sorry, maybe crazy was a bit extreme, but it's undesirable, right? So if we're trying to get rid of undesirable things like Sybil attacks and plutocracy, we don't want to then create something which is subject to something else like collusion, right? Because collusion is also a bad thing. You can get actors combining together to hijack the voting, and people with small token holdings will then suffer from that. So we want to avoid, I mean, we didn't explicitly think of collusion as a problem, but when we ended up with the fact that Sybil resistance needs a linear function, we thought of getting rid of collusion as one of the reasons why it has to be linear.
Got it, thank you. In your opinion, would incorporating a tool like World ID or ZK Passport, which offer Sybil resistance, allow you to run a fair vote using only a function like log Q?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah, so the question's up on the screen there. So it is, in your opinion, would incorporating something like World ID or ZK Passport, something which offers Sybil resistance, allow you to run a fair vote using a function like log Q?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you've got log Q, that is going to be plutocracy resistant, in my opinion. That's strictly it is going to be. But you do need something else, and that could be something like proof of personhood, right? So yes, if you've got a POP protocol or something in the background, you need another instrument then to take care of the Sybil resistance. Log Q itself will guarantee you plutocracy resistance. But then how are you going to guarantee the Sybil resistance? You've got to have another instrument. In fact, proof of person protocols are being investigated for that purpose, how to use it to avoid a Sybil resistance, but you've got to have that instrument, and that's perfectly valid, right? So if you want to give log Q as your curvature to Q in that voting function, you've got to have a second instrument that could be proof of personhood, proof of identity, ZK, whatever you're able to devise, that second instrument has to be there.
Got it, yeah, yep. That makes sense. Okay, a couple more questions there then. Is there anyone using bond voting in DAOs?
No, absolutely not at this stage. This has come out of our head at this point. But if some DAO does want to use bond voting, we'd be thrilled and more than happy to, figure out how it can be translated to the real world.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe we'll say this is the penultimate one. Can this time lock be manipulated by an attacker, tricking tokens into locking up for too long, then using smaller amount of liquidity to maybe pass dangerous legislation?
Tricking tokens into locking up, I'm not sure how you would trick and then using smaller liquidity. Yeah, I mean, but the whole point of, that can happen in time lock in the sense of vote escrow, but how would you trick when you can get, so the tokens that are being tricked in this case, in this example, if you can get out of that commitment, you won't remain tricked, right? So if you can sell that token commitment and move on, then how do you remain tricked? So that's the whole point of having the secondary market, that you cannot have stuff like this. If for any reason whatsoever you feel like you need to get out of those tokens, maybe you're being tricked, you get out of them.
Got it. Yeah. But I guess there would be a discount, though, right? There would be a pretty big.
There would be a discount. So if you've locked up Q tokens, no one is ever going to pay more than Q for claiming Q at the end. So there will be a discount, but the discount is based on the amount of time left and what they think those Q tokens are going to be valued at the end when they get it. So it's based on market perception.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. Nice note to finish on. Well, thanks again, Vijay.
Thank you very
round
much.
of applause. Great talk.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.